observed or threats to be avoided. In this possibly terminal phase of human existence, democracy and freedom are more than values to be treasured. They may well be essential to survival.
And welcome back to the show. I scream, you scream. You know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. Well, I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
The Communist Party does not support the Sandinistas. They don't believe in what the Sandinistas believe in. They're not killing Russians. They're not killing KGB. They're not killing Cubans, God forbid. I hope they never do kill Cubans. They're just killing people that happen to have the misfortune of being born in northern.
I scream, you scream. Well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, we all know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, we all know the rest of it, right? I scream, you scream.
In Nicaragua. We've done this in Angola, Vietnam. We've done it over 20,000 times in the last 35 years. The Church Committee report showed us that over several hundred covert actions per year for 30.
Scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest. I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest. Well, I scream, you scream, well, I think you know the rest. I scream, you scream.
That's got to be 15 to 20,000 covert operations. The toll of dead now, first-line victims, has got to be over 1 million people killed. You know, you give arms to the Contras, you send them in and they kill people. It's got to be over. There were 800,000 in Indonesia alone from the CIA's own figures.
John, there was an analysis last.
You know the rest.
I scream, you scream, and everybody knows the rest. I scream, you scream, well, you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest.
I scream, you scream, you know the rest.
I don't find that funny, I find it scary.
Bringing entertainment to thousands of people. Through it.
Week in these times about the CIA operations in Nicaragua, and they made the interesting point, first of all, this is precisely the same thing that the CIA did in 1954 in Guatemala when
With magic, we are able to enjoy a combination of the radio, motion pictures, and the stage, right in the comfort of our own home, simply by pushing a button and turning a dial. These cells with their electrical charges are scanned by a stream of electrons, completing 30 pictures a second.
they supported counter-revolutionary forces to overthrow a legitimately elected government. And it was the same thing they attempted to do but failed at the Bay of Pigs, where they also armed mercenaries. Could you give us some insight, since you know the CIA from the inside, about how the CIA carries out an operation like this to try to destabilize and
Compare that crude picture with these of today, and you can judge for yourself how far along the road to perfection television has traveled.
Most people still today think that all entertainment to do with movies, drama, is
a legitimately elected government, or one that has come from the people.
Indeed, and my book, In Search of Enemies, is a blueprint for what they're doing in Nicaragua. The headquarters is in Washington. It's a global operation, pulling strings in every corner of the world, working.
It's therefore nothing more than their entertainment. It never ever was that case.
Of course, television can't perform such miracles as this, yet. But perhaps there's no harm wishing that it could.
The greatest social messages are promoted through movies and drama.
From bases in the U.S. for much of your training and shipping your arms, and then working from neighboring countries. In this case, it's Honduras and Costa Rica. In Angola, it was Zaire and Zambia, and hiring mercenaries to go in and do the killing for you. The budget in the
My drama, through the fixation of emotive sequences, emotional sequences, not logical, factual sequences, but pushing points across in an emotional way which register and fix in the mind. So emotional content is very, very important, rather than
Angolan operation initially was 14 million. This budget was 19 million, so sort of an inflation factor. When it started, of course, it's gone up. They're using the Honduran army to put up additional arms and supplies and airplanes, much as we did Mobutu's army before. But let me back up a minute.
go through an actual discussion or an argument using logic and facts. There's no debate. And when you're being downloaded through fiction, your guard is down, the sensor part of your brain is not in action. It isn't saying, yes, I agree with this, I disagree with that.
About the Guatemalan operation in '54, ousting Jacobo BENZ. He was trying to take back the land, buy it back from United Fruit Company, which owned the country, and parcel it out to the people so they could sell the fruit to United Fruit Company, so they would have a little bit of a stake in their country.
And this was land which United Fruit was not using.
You would in a debate or a lecture, you're actually in an alpha state being completely downloaded with new ideas. When radio came along, of course, they used that to the maximum. Sports for the men, soaps basically for the women, and then in came television, as I say, with its alpha state, its hypnotic state. And sure enough, around the 1960s really,
well,
basically.
Some of it, yeah, they weren't using. Others they were using, but he was going to pay him $2.98 an acre, and this was exactly twice what they had paid for it 10 years before. So 100% profit.
'50s and '60s, it took off. It really took off. And men became glued on Saturday nights to the sports shows. A culture industry, which is called by its own the culture industry. The Soviet Union had a department called the culture.
The State Department stepped in and said $75 an acre, which was outrageous, and the country couldn't possibly come up with that kind of money. So they told the American public and the world that this was a communist government threatening our national security.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
Very